It's my very great privilege to be chair of our session this afternoon, which, as you'll all be aware, is tax cooperation, designing an international tax system for the 21st century. Now, this is a topic of increasing importance. Naturally, as you'll appreciate, the rise of globalization, digital trading, and so on and so forth, that the need for tax cooperation, proponents would say, has never, ever been greater. Cross-border trade, as you may be aware, back in 1990 accounted for something like 15% of world GDP. And estimates suggest that by 2015, it's expected that cross-border trade will be around 30% of world GDP. Now, London would argue that it's always been seen as, considered to be, a hub for global trade since back in the 19th century. And when I refer to global trade, I suppose in that context now we're talking about globalization. And I think one might argue that London's always understood the value and the importance of globalization. It's the home of global markets, of global banks, global law firms, global trading. And whilst globalization brings many, many benefits, it also, in our context, I think, carries some other more complex disadvantages, or certainly issues we need to look at. You might argue, for example, that globalization in this context provides companies with more opportunities, or multinational companies with more opportunities for tax minimization as they seek to exploit, if I might use that word, countries' national tax systems. And it would be argued, I think, that that advantage available to the largest multinational corporations is not something that's necessarily available as a means of reducing costs, for example, to a national or smaller domestic enterprise. So multinational organizations can spread their activities so they don't, for example, breach concepts or thresholds for permanent establishment. And so what we've also got to face, I think, is that in the way in which modern trade operates, how do tax authorities, how do those who set policy here, identify where value or profit is being created? And as you'll know, thinking about BEPS, that the view has emerged, something must be done, and something must be done on an international, multilateral, cooperative basis. But perhaps one of the things this audience will want to consider is whether those steps that might be considered need to ensure that we don't risk compromising the effectiveness of London. How does that play with a sense of cooperation? This is a pretty complex and significant issue, the ramifications of which will rumble on for some time. So, one can say, well, we need the same sort of rules applying across a common platform for all, as it were, trading nations. But why is that necessarily the case? And how would it be done? How do we deal with protecting companies, for example, from the risk of double taxation? How do we ensure that tax is fairly allocated across a global company's, as it were, trading footprint? You'll also have heard from the Lord Mayor's remarks this morning of the judgment from the EU Court of Justice dismissing the UK government's legal challenge on the use of the enhanced cooperation procedures which were used as part of the process for the possible introduction of financial transaction tax. Now, in essence, as I understand it, and I'm sure many of you will have had a chance to look at the headlines around this judgment over the course of the afternoon, it seems to me that the courts dismissed that action on the basis of it being premature, not necessarily because the court has made a substantive and final decision. And it also seems to me that it's entirely possible that there will be other arguments, not only on the process for any decisions that are eventually taken, but potential challenges in relation to the way that financial transaction tax, as a feature, let us say, of cooperation in this context, might operate, and the possibility, if I can use the expression without being jingoistic, of challenges against the extraterritorial implications of the decisions as we currently understand the proposals. And you'll know, I think, that many of the organizations in this room, and certainly the Law Society, have raised a number of concerns about those extraterritorial aspects of what is currently proposed in relation to FTT by the European Commission. So this is something that I think we're all going to be watching very closely, big implications for what's going to happen here in London, thinking about those comments I made about being this hub for global trading. So to help us begin our consideration this afternoon of that topic, we have a stellar cast of speakers. The eagle-eyed amongst you will have seen that we have a slight change to personnel, and I'm delighted that we have Dr. Achim Pross here to make the first opening remarks to you. I've asked Achim to speak for about 15 minutes and then for my 3 remaining speakers to speak for about 10 minutes or so, because I'm really anxious not only do we stick to time, but that we maximise the opportunity for interaction between our panellists and in particular the opportunity for you to raise questions. So let me start then by introducing Achim, if I may. He's Head of International Cooperation and Tax Administration Division within the OECD Centre for Tax Policy and Administration. We're very grateful indeed for you being available to join us at short notice today. Prior to joining OECD, he worked in the tax departments of a very large US law firm, I think working in Washington, D.C., subsequently in Paris, and now here in London. So, Achim, perhaps I can ask you to start us off.